Tuesdays. I'm WESH 2 meteorologist Eric Burris, joined, of course, by my partner.
All right, I'm WJCL 22 Chief Meteorologist Jeremy Nelson here in Savannah.
All right, so lots happened since we launched this thing last week. We haven't had any named tropical storms in that timeline, but Jeremy, we did have an interesting storm system develop over the weekend, really impacting your area.
Yeah, we had some pretty high impacts here. We had tropical storm force winds at our coastline. We had record rainfall. We were sort of on the western half of that system, so it pulled in some really chilly air, and we had some record low high temperatures, meaning the coolest high temperature ever for the date, and that was on Saturday. Also, we tied two record low temperatures, and as you see there, the spin with that almost had what was an eye-looking feature. That was the center of the circulation.
Yeah, so, when we talk about tropical systems, all the time people are like, well, it has that look, and that's fine. But we always have to remember that tropical systems and non-tropical systems, they have the same kind of a look, right? Areas of low pressure always spin counterclockwise, Jeremy. But this was an interesting little bird because it brought a bunch of rain to my area. Then as soon as it got out over water, it started to look more and more tropical in nature. And here's that visible satellite imagery of it kind of, I would say, at its peak. And it definitely looked like something more than just a coastal low.
Yeah, and our winds here peaked from Saturday, probably around maybe 1 or 2 a.m. through about 9 to 10 a.m. We did have some wind advisories for our coastline. We took a look at this last night. We did a little diving back. The coastal forecast and also the marine products that the National Weather Service put out covered this very well. They had some of those areas maybe up to 60 nautical miles away from the coastline with wind gusts up to potentially 55 miles per hour. And we're going to talk about in just a moment. We have pretty good verification that actually happened.
Yeah, so when we talk about those advisories, let's just start off, and I'm going to bring this full screen here, all right? So let's just start off with, this is an update from your local forecast office, Jeremy. So this is kind of, we'll say, a little more technical text, but from the top, storm warning remains in effect, yada, yada. They're pointing out north winds of 30 to 40 knots. This is offshore, of course, with gusts up to 55 knots and seas running 10 to 15 feet. So that's from the Charleston National Weather Service office, whereas the National Hurricane Center put this statement out talking about a gale warning, pointing winds of 30 to 40 knots, seas of 13 to 19 feet. So at the end of the day here, whether it was named or not, both the National Hurricane Center and your local Charleston National Weather Service office absolutely posted information about this storm system.
Yeah, and the winds, one of the buoys out there offshore, off from sort of the Georgia, South Carolina coast that's out there, had a measured wind gust to 60 miles per hour. And then, of course, making headlines is the cruise that was kind of stuck off from the South Carolina coast, is trying to get into the Charleston area.
Yeah.
But the waves were too big, and also the winds, at least on that ship, were hurricane force wind gusts.
Right. So, and we've seen imagery showing the quote unquote apparent wind of 69 knots. The ship was going at about 5 knots. So even if it's 65 knots, with the wind correction angle, you're still talking about hurricane force wind gusts. Now, that said, cruise ships are, they're 10, 12 stories tall, so we don't know exactly where that wind measuring equipment necessarily was, Jeremy.
Right.
But it's a rough day, and I was listening this morning on the national news broadcasts, and they were talking about how the captain basically said on the ship, we're going into some weather. You may notice some, I forget the exact term, but it was like, you may notice some additional rocking. And like, you see these videos, you see the imagery of the waves slamming on the side of the ship. This was a terrible, terrible situation for those that were cruising on this.
Yeah, and again, this isn't too far away from Savannah to Charleston, maybe 2 hours, a little bit more than that. So we cover low country things, and I think this is getting a lot of national attention now. But you can see where that wind gust of 69 knots, and maybe there was one higher than that. Again, this was a report, and we saw the image that someone took off from like their television on the cruise ship that shows the location of the ship, the lat lawn, the wind, everything like that. Similar to if you're in an airplane and you want to know what your ground speed is, where you're at, and things like that. So maybe there was a higher gust in there. Not sure if that cruise ship's going to be forthcoming with that information. I know they have it stored, but at least from someone on there, we know that the equipment did measure a wind gust of 69 knots.
Well, and the passengers that were on the ship went on to say that at some point during the morning, they changed that channel that gives the weather information to a standby slate. So for what we know, it could have been higher, or they just kind of wanted to, diminish the information. And that, I think, is a bigger question, right? Like, the National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center warned on this. Now, there's a lot of people on social media, Jeremy, that are like, it was a tropical storm. It was a subtropical storm. But at the end of the day, no matter what it was, the impacts were well forecast. So it leads me to just kind of wonder, if it was a named system, do you think that Carnival would have gone in the way that they did? Or because they said it's not named, even if the impacts were the same, did they treat it any differently? What do you think?
I don't know what their criteria is. I know whether it's an airline, a cruise ship, they do have meteorologists, not necessarily on the vessel or in an aircraft, but they have a team that is analyzing the weather conditions. So was it like, hey, you have a window, you can make it into the harbor, or was it, maybe this wasn't tropical storm warning, so our criteria is we can sail through a marine warning or a storm warning with seas maybe 7 to 12 feet. When it comes down to it at the end, I think whether it's an airline and steering around thunderstorms or turbulence, if you know it's there, you want your customers to come back. So I think hindsight's 2020. And maybe if they had the decision again, they would have just kind of stayed offshore or maybe hung to the east of Florida and then waited a day and gone in.
So one thing that's interesting, Jeremy, a couple of years ago, we of course remember the sinking of the El Faro, that cargo vessel that was in, was it Irma? I can't remember the storm, but it was.
Or was it? It was one of maybe Maria.
It was one of those storms off of like the southeast United States east coast. So a Royal Caribbean ship got banged up pretty good from that same storm system. Okay. And Royal Caribbean went out and hired a meteorologist. And the meteorologist has been on staff with Royal Caribbean for years. He just announced that he's leaving Royal Caribbean, but they do have that job posted. They are the only cruise line that has an on-staff meteorologist, at least that I'm aware of. I believe at the time, at least, Royal's thing was first of an industry kind. And so you have to wonder, are they, it's like, are they as Caribbean, as Disney, as all these other organizations, are they looking at these cases and saying, maybe we need to bring in more knowledge, whether it be a company to consult or whether it be an on-staff meteorologist?
Yeah, I mean, weather, what is it that people always say, especially like private consultants, it's a how many billion-dollar industry every year, or maybe higher than that now. No matter where you're located, a lot of locations have a big exposure to the weather. So, yeah, this system not only ruined at least probably Friday and Saturday of the Memorial Day weekend, just for people wanting to go to the beach. I went out to not too far from my house. It's a quick drive to Tybee Island and grab some video on Saturday, and there was just a handful of people out there, and it was there was a thunderstorm moving on shore. We had the stronger winds, and we can get into this now. Kind of the genesis of that storm, and could have been subtropical, or was it just a regular area of low pressure and a coastal low.
Sure. So the argument from the Hurricane Center, and that's, listen, this is not a mission by any stretch to like throw anybody under a bus or to call anybody out, but this is a product that FSU that is put together by folks at FSU and Penn State, and the idea behind this is it's to track storm systems and watch their genesis, whether it's cold core, whether it's warm core. And this was the argument from the National Hurricane Center. I'll get to that more in a moment. But that storm system is a decent storm system. You don't need to be a meteorologist to tell that. Looking at this product here, and this is just kind of the gusts, and this was from one of my tweets over the weekend, but you can see buoys showing 54 mile per hour gusts, Jeremy, 45 mile per hour gusts, 35 mile per hour gusts. But the Hurricane Center's perspective on this was that it was attached to a front the entire time, and thus, because of it having a frontal influence, it was non-tropical and non-subtropical. But there's so much more than just that, because if you look at the genesis of the storm system, what this does is it shows kind of the trajectory. So A is the beginning of the storm system cyclogenesis, essentially. Z is the end of it, and then there's a C in there for current, but it's at the end. So the idea is that as this started bombing, at least according to this analysis, as it started deepening and deepening, it was a symmetric warm core that then went asymmetric warm core, which that would give me indication of a subtropical element to it. And then as it made its way ashore, it went cold core, asymmetric, and symmetric. So, I mean, Jeremy, that I think that there could be a case to be made that in the next few months, and probably at the end of hurricane season, that they go back and at least there's a case to be made that this could have had at some point subtropical characteristics.
Yeah, I think you showed like a 700 millibar map also. Yep. That had some warm characteristics with it. So at the end of the day, could have it been subtropical based on some of the things you've shown? Certainly, maybe it could have been subtropical storm and then gone extratropical. We've seen that before. I mean, maybe the whole thing was just tied to those fronts, but then I go back to the unnamed storm in January, and I was looking at the NCEP archive maps in January 14, 15, 16. At least those maps were showing that system had some fronts tied to it.
And what's kind of funny is there's always the social meteorologists, right? The people that whatever their education is or what have you. So you posted those NCEP maps, I posted those NCEP maps, and they had fronts tied to that system in January. And I got a few people that were like, those aren't really fronts, or, well, it dropped the fronts. And it's like, well, but weather really is a subjective field. It's kind of like medicine, right? Like it's a family medical practice. So not everybody's going to view things the same. It doesn't mean that anybody's wrong. It's just who's in the position of interpretation.
Yeah, well, I mean, you just look every single day when we make a forecast, you might, if people like flip around or something, they may see different numbers. So it's, we look at the same models, most of us, and hey, maybe we come up with some different numbers. So
right.
I think in that storm system moved over the Gulf Stream, which that water was at least 75, I think 80 degrees before it got churned up by that storm.
Yeah.
Our nearshore temperatures pre-coastal low were around 75 to 77 in Savannah. They did. You start to churn all that water, you get some upwelling, and our temperature dropped now to the upper 60s. That'll probably recover fast, but that just shows you get a lot of that turbulent wave action, and it can bring up some of that cooler water.
So what I'm doing here is I'm just kind of clicking in that area now. Okay, so that's now. Nearshore waters, yeah, upper 60s, lower 70s by you, but well offshore there in the Gulf Stream, it's still sitting right at about that 79, 80 degree mark. So there's something there, of warm water, and that'll be one of those interesting things we'll have to watch.
Right. So as of now, we just have, with the season just a couple days away, we just have an unnamed storm. So storm number one has been checked, but we're still waiting for the first named storm. But maybe we have some candidates coming up here or parts of the pattern that we'll be keeping an eye on.
Yeah, 2 days from hurricane season. And for right now, Jeremy, we are quiet. The Hurricane Center has put out their latest tropical weather outlook. No development is expected over the next 7 days. But I use the word expected, and I put an influence on that because just because there's nothing expected doesn't mean that there's not something, at least, that we're watching. Let me zoom in here a little closer to our area, and particularly out in the Gulf of Mexico there.
Yeah, and that's right now, that's getting sheared pretty good. There's some upper level winds, but yeah, kind of just like cluster of thunderstorms. We'll see what happens, but that should drift near Florida. And then models definitely differ. They kind of have like two lows, so just there's maybe one huge broad area of low pressure, and then we'll have to see kind of what happens down at the surface.
Right. So here's kind of the overall interesting idea, if you will. So for Saturday, and this is, there is it one low, is it two lows? Models are trying to show an area of low pressure bubbling up and bringing a whole lot of rain down here, my direction. But as it crosses the peninsula into Sunday, Jeremy, that's where things start to get more and more interesting.
Yeah, I think so. And now your water temps also would be pretty warm. Probably that area, it has to be around 80 degrees.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Here, let's zoom in. The nearshore waters definitely got churned up. Like there's 72 off of Jacksonville, 74. But you get into the Gulf Stream waters, and there's your magic numbers, right? Anything above 80 is doable for tropical development. So once this crosses over Florida and moves out east of us, that's where we could be talking about some sort of tropical development. And I think it's interesting that the Hurricane Center hasn't taken note of this at all.
Right. I mean, maybe they're like, hey, there could be a front attached to something again, or would it miss out on one of those other boxes it needs to check? But yeah, as we're getting closer to the weekend, here we are Tuesday, kind of that shortened work week. So day already Tuesday, and their forecast now goes out 7 days. So right. I would think at some point maybe they'll throw at least a 10% chance on this.
So what we're looking at here, this is the ensemble plots, the European computer forecast model. And what you're looking at, this is, for folks that watch me on Coffee Talk in Orlando, this is nothing new. But for our WJCL friends, what you're looking at is the European model thrown together 50 different ways. An ensemble means it's the same model just over and over and over and over again, but with some subtle changes. And this product, what it's looking for is areas of low pressure. So timestamp in the top right corner of your screen. So that's 18Z Friday morning.
And then Eric, circle both of those areas, because we're kind of looking at two different areas that models are trying to hint at. There's one maybe a little ways down to the south of Bermuda, well northeast of the Bahamas, and then that other area near Florida.
Yeah. So and I can't circle this way, but at least we can reference it. But yeah, so you've got those areas like this is 18Z on Friday. So 18Z, that's 2 p.m. Friday. That area near Bermuda, and then the ensembles are trying to show around Florida a clustering of something. And when it's just the quote-unquote Euro or quote-unquote GFS, that's one model. But the power of these ensembles is the ability to say, there's 50 different versions of the European, there's 50 different versions of the GFS. And so it gives you kind of strength in numbers. And when you've got so many of these ensemble plots trying to throw something together, to me, that's at least something worth mentioning.
I think so. I mean, all those lows are pretty much clustered in that Southwest Atlantic area again. I think most models then can kind of track this to the northeast. So versus pushing it back into land, it's moving it to the northeast. Right.
So these are the GFS ensembles, and the GFS is not as gangbusters as the European is. The European is pretty tightly clustered. And if I were to take and go one model run back, Yeah, you can kind of see the model's spread out, so they're taking it off to the northeast, but they're not 100% sure on where. But the tighter these ensembles are, the more consistency the guidance gives us. And so just taking a couple of questions here. Meredith from your page, Jeremy, is asking, what impact would this be to Savannah area?
Again, it really depends on the track. If it would take a similar track to what we had this past weekend, then again, we'd probably be looking at rain, some gusty winds, and not the best of weather conditions. But if it goes more due northeast, we would be on the drier side of that, so wouldn't be as cool, probably have a little more sun, and rain chances might be closer to the coastline, if any. So if it goes a little more north, then we're into more impacts. And then also the question of, is this going to develop into a surface feature and strengthen? And may need to see another couple days here before we start to talk sort of more fine-tuned impacts.
Right. John is asking, question, does the Nicole low come out of Mexico or just develop in the Gulf? And that is this part of the weather pattern that we're watching right now out in the, it's coming, at least this cycle it's kind of developing over the Gulf of Mexico, Jeremy, and then crossing the peninsula.
Right. If you remember back to November and sort of the methodology we used, that low did maybe touch the Gulf of Mexico or get very close to it. So there, and also back in November, we highlighted this. I think it was on November 4th or 6th. I have my notes that I can look back on. But there were actually two areas of interest that there was one that was sort of south of Bermuda, well northeast of the Bahamas, and then another one closer to the Florida area or the Bahamas. So even back then, it kind of had those two features.
Interesting. It's just interesting no matter how you slice it. But this is going to be, at least for us, the next area that we're going to be watching. Whether or not it develops, whether or not anything, it just kind of allows, Jeremy, you and I to continue monitoring the overall weather patterns and seeing how this is working and making sure we're on time for our long-range forecast.
Right. So it was around November 3rd to 6th that the Hurricane Center highlighted two different areas out in the Southwest Atlantic.
Okay. All right. So we're continuing on par for everything. So should we, you think we should kind of chat about what we're looking at ahead for the month of June?
Yeah. So, I think the first week obviously will be whatever happens in the Southwest Atlantic near Florida area. Clearly to us, that is sort of the number one part of at least our forecast that we made back in the spring. So, or actually late winter, back around March 1st. So I'm more curious how that's going to look in July and then especially into September.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no doubt about it. And then after that, we look to a couple of the not hotspot parts of the pattern. We look to the, by about the 13th through the 19th of June, Jeremy, we start to watch that offshore northeastern United States part of the pattern, the same part of the cycling weather pattern that gave us the January 16th storm system.
Yep, that unnamed storm. So here we are, almost to hurricane season. We've technically had one name or one storm that could have been named this year, so there's just storm number one, and then our next storm will just get picked up with Arlene. Yeah,
and then after that, the Bay of Campeche, South Texas. It's not a hot spot, but around the 20th through the 24th of June, that's the repeat. Is it Julia or is it Carl?
I can look back here, but that was like October 11th, so we're just sort of in the new part of the pattern being established. That was Carl down there. So it's just an area that we'll be monitoring.
Yeah.
See if there's an area of low pressure down there.
But we're definitely getting into hurricane season. And when we look at the month of June, give me 2 seconds here. When we look at the month of June, it is typically areas near the southeastern United States for tropical development. The Gulf of Mexico is a big one, crossing over Florida and then moving around. So none of this is out of the norm, right?
Right. Yeah, I would say the waters are warming up quickly in the Gulf of Mexico and then east of Florida into the southwestern Atlantic. So we really have to monitor those areas when we go into June. June, again, I think it's obviously less than 10% of all named storms have formed during the first month of hurricane season. Really,
Right.
the things start to ramp up August, September, and then the first half of October.
Yeah, that's right. So 2 days left until the beginning of hurricane season. But at least for now, at least at the moment, there is nothing to track, which I'm okay with. But I do think that this weekend we're going to be watching around Florida. And then after that, we'll be kind of watching for something out in the open Atlantic. There's been so much talk about El Nino. There's been so much talk about how the hurricane forecast numbers are all over the place. But I think the sheer fact that these water temperatures are anomalously hotter than they have ever been during the month of May, heading into June, Jeremy, that's a point that just cannot be ignored.
Yeah, I think we have to watch it, and we're not even into the time of year yet where we start to see the systems come off the west coast to Africa. So we'll have to see how active that is. And really, I believe in the last couple of years, we already had some Saharan dust, I felt like, early in the season, and I don't think I've really seen much of that so far.
Stand by, loading that up.
Okay.
There's some. It's not, it's not a ton, and it's out over the kind of like African coast there. So what we're ending up with is keeping things quiet out near the Cabo Verde Islands, but that's not where you're watching for storm development early in the season anyway. You're not really seeing any in the Caribbean. You're not really seeing any dust in the Gulf of Mexico, and those are the areas that you're watching for development early in the season.
Yeah, so we'll see if any dust comes into play. Obviously, I still think El Nino, yes, it is strengthening. To me, the ENSO can play a role, but it's a little more of a wild card. I don't see a lot of people raising their hands that said last year would be active with maybe close to 20 named storms and pointing to La Nina like, oh, hey, look, it was a La Nina year. It should have been active. We use a little different methodology. And we did look at La Nina years, and when you threw the three consecutive together, the numbers started to trend down. So that's why last year we kind of went average hurricane season.
And I would think that based on this, we would probably still trend quieter toward the end of this hurricane season, which then would probably play into a bit of a quieter hurricane season next year. Jason Bishop, though, is asking an interesting question, still trying to understand how Pacific water is above average, which means El Nino, but yet the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean are above average as well. With the trade wind effect, I call that neutral, Jason saying. And I think at the end of the day, Jeremy, we are currently sitting technically in a neutral zone.
I think so. I think we're in, is it an El Nino watch right now?
Yes,
Something
yeah,
like
so
that.
we're getting there.
Right. And is that from the Climate Prediction Center that puts that out? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
it's just one of those things. It's just one of those things, the thing about weather is that you have to watch 1,000 different elements and you have to calculate them. And no matter how good you are, there's always going to be other little pieces of the puzzle that you don't necessarily get, right? And I think that's the difficult part. But if you just look at one piece alone, you're going to struggle. So take, for example, here's your sea surface temperature anomaly map, okay? And around Florida, particularly off of South Florida, the sea surface temperatures are running 2, 3, 4 degrees warmer than they are typically this time of year. Now, there is a little bit of upwelling up off the coastline there of, Georgia and of the Carolinas. That's thanks to this coastal storm system from over the weekend. But Jeremy, water temperatures down in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico are warm, very, very warm for this time of year.
Right, and those upwellings, I think those will kind of fill in with some of that warmer surface water here, give it another maybe week. So if we do see an area of low pressure that scoots across Florida and is closer to the Bahamas, that water kind of is untouched, still very warm. We'll have to see what kind of surface low we get going and what the structure of any possible storm would be. But I definitely think first week of June, there's potential that maybe we get our first named storm.
Yeah, and first name storm technically second name the mind meld. So a bunch of people are just asking, different questions. William's asking, what time will the storm be here on Sunday? It's not going to work that way, bud. We're going to be moistening up late week into the weekend.
Yeah. Well,
go ahead.
I mean, just looking at models, I think you're just going to have a couple days before there's any type of storm development, even where you're just going to have a lot of probably higher rain chances.
Oh yeah, I mean, let's just look at the evolution of this, right? So this is a long range model, okay? And you can kind of see that Gulf area of moisture there. But look how Thursday into Friday, we're just moistening things up, and then we get that area of low pressure kind of moving through. I mean, there's Saturday, 4 p.m., that's a bunch of rain. That's Saturday, 10 p.m., still a bunch of rain. And then into Sunday, still a bunch of rain as it kind of moves off the shoreline. So I think it's going to be wet for us. I think it's going to be wet in Florida. And then it just depends on its eventual motion if it dries you out, Jeremy, in your area, or if you end up getting a bunch of rain too.
Well, this is one of the wettest parts of the pattern for you.
Yes, it is. It has been over and over. And at the end of the day, this storm system is what was Nicole last year. We know that was a tropical system. It's certainly not going to do that again now. But if we look over future cycles, this is going to be that opportunity, Jeremy, where Central Florida, South Florida, once again, will have to really watch for something tropical, particularly toward like the peak of hurricane season.
Yeah, and I just think back to last year when we identified probably our most significant part of the pattern, the floor-easter, and we were kind of stressing like we can see reflections of it coming back through the pattern, but really watch out during the peak of hurricane season, and that's definitely, unfortunately, when it sort of showed its ugly face.
I think one thing to me, and this, you're not going to like to hear this, right? But I think to me, the one thing that has really stood out to me over the last few months' time is that our friends in the Carolinas, luck is probably going to be running out this season, at least to me in terms of observation.
Yeah, I mean, just look over the last probably week and a half, I think. There's been 2 lows that have gone kind of right up towards like the South Carolina, North Carolina area.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you look back, it's been a consistent recycle, which would tell me at some point this hurricane season, I've got to believe we're going to get a storm moving up that direction.
Yeah, I mean that's why it's a hot spot.
Right. And if you're new to this hotspot idea, Jeremy and I co-author a hurricane forecast every year. We put it out on March the 1st, okay? Here's the hotspots that we have highlighted for this year. Jeremy, would you just kind of tell everybody a little bit more about this?
Right. Well, we identified a couple areas of low pressure that seemed like they're always tracking maybe like Alabama, Florida Panhandle down to that west coast of Florida. And then what we're learning now is seeing these repeat is that we'll have to watch then as they cross Florida and head off the southeast coastline.
Right.
How much will they strengthen, and then will they develop into a tropical system? We were extremely close over this last weekend to seeing that happen. And then the Carolinas, a couple different parts of the pattern could support those systems moving up in that direction. Yeah. And then obviously that east coast of Florida, when we take a look into the first week of June, already potentially some of that exposure showing.
So Cindy's asking, how many times does a storm pattern recycle? So it depends on the year. This year is about a 50, 51, 52 day cycle. So October, November, we set up this new pattern, and then it recycles over and over and over again. And it's plus or minus a couple of days here or there. But we've gotten to the point where we've been able to give some time frames, Jeremy, and to give these hotspots. Yeah. And I think those are going to be the areas that at least have the above average threat for landfall. But to me, the area that is surprisingly busy is going to be the Carolina coastline.
Yeah, that is definitely starting to show up like an area that really should be monitored as we go through this hurricane season. And when we talk about the cycling part of the pattern, we're going to, once we get out of that first week of June, we might start to see at least some of our hotspot areas, maybe not quite as hot. And then once we get into that, into July, especially pushing through week 1 into week 2, that kind of opens up about a 3 or 3.5 week window once again, where we have a series of some systems we'll have to watch.
Yeah. June is going to be quieting down for my area and really for your area, but into July, we need to put our antennas back up. It's not to say that nothing will develop around us, certainly, but it's the overall cycling pattern favors development and impact around us a little bit less. Mickey's asking, so since this is Tropics talk, do any other models support the low this weekend, the CMC, the UK Med, etc.? Yes, I would say, and I'll just dial this up here. Give me 2 seconds to just get back to like.
And I think they all have a low, whether it's going to develop tropical is the question.
Right. So this, for example, this is the GFS, and you can kind of see. So you've got lowering pressure, right? You've got lowering pressure. So that's the GFS. The European is doing the same thing. The European's trying to maybe develop something in the Gulf and then swing it through. What do we've got? The Canadian model. There's the area of low pressure kind of bubbling up around. So that's the Canadian model. The CMC. There you go. Around, what is that? That's the 30th. It's trying to show lowered pressures. That's the broader CMC extended. But here's the Canadian kind of more mesoscale. There we go. Yeah, so there's the lowered pressure. So they're all trying to sniff something out. Exact timing may be a little different. Exact positioning may be a little different. But they're all trying to sniff some things out.
And again, we have that high sitting to the north, and that's usually pretty good setup to get something tropical going, or at least kind of protects it to the north, and then it's over some of the warmest water we have once again.
Yeah. So Brian had asked about why, in layman's terms, that Carolina system over the weekend didn't develop or hadn't developed. Brian, rewind. We talked a pretty good amount at the beginning of the broadcast, and we just don't want to rehash that. But there's definitely some interesting studying I think that they'll be doing. Ari Riggs says, I've been surprised that the Carolinas have been spared in recent years, and it all, I think, has to do with just the different patterns that we've been in.
Yeah, I mean, they've had name storms move in there. Last year we had Colin. Don't really get us started on that one.
Yeah.
But they've had some name storms. But, yeah, you think I'm trying to think back. I mean, obviously Florence made a landfall there.
Mike is pointing out the last biggie here in North Carolina was Florence a few years ago.
Yeah, and then clearly Matthew made a landfall there. It was weakening, but still, I mean, it did some damage there for friends along the coast.
Yeah, so, I think that, for the Carolinas, there's going to be several opportunities. But into the month of July, for sure, our friends in the Carolinas are going to need to be watching things very, very closely.
Yes. And then, like I said, that coastal low we just had over the weekend, what's that going to look like in future cycles as well?
Yeah. All right. Anything else that you could think of, Jeremy?
No, I'm just kind of keeping an eye on some new model stuff coming in, and really nothing too much. It really doesn't strengthen that low in the Gulf of Mexico. It just sort of drifts it to the east. Yep. And your weather here looks like you're going to have plenty of showers and thunderstorms to track. Good time.
Well, look, I'm filling the pool as we speak, so it's just going to work that way, isn't it? All right, so that's this. That's this fun thing we call the Tracking the Tropics Tuesday or whatever. Just a reminder, I don't know what we've decided on, but just a reminder, if you miss us live, or if you want to listen to in other platforms, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Probably if you lift under a rock, you'll find us down there too. Jeremy, we're trying to put this out everywhere to get information on the tropics out and hopefully encourage discussion pushing into the heart of hurricane season.
Right, and it's interactive, so tell family and friends. Obviously, some people may be at work, but as Eric just showed you, some great ways that you can stay up to date. And then we're on social media, so you can go follow us on our various social media platforms. Both of us are posting a lot about the tropics and just weather conditions from the southeast all the way down through Florida. So I think with our chat here, we have a good thing going. We can keep people updated before these systems move in, explain sort of our methodology when we talk long range, and then we fill the gaps in between.
Yeah. So we'll do this again next Tuesday. Probably going to be rainy and another storm system off the East Coast. And what I think is so fun about this, Jeremy, is that it's interactive. And the more we grow this thing, the more I think folks will benefit, because we can and will and do get into the weeds. And I like it. I like it a lot.
Yes. And I think it was great to just kind of talk about that coastal low.
Yeah.
Hash that out a little bit because it was for some, it was a fairly high impact event.
Yeah.
Even in my area, just from sort of persistent gusty winds, a lot of the rain that was coming down 1 to 3 inches, and then some of those higher gusts that were maybe 35, 45 miles per hour. We did have some power outages. Those were mainly due to we had some trees come down in parts of the area. So it was, it kind of had that look, the look of a tropical system in our area. Maybe didn't feel like it. It was kind of cool here, but the impacts pretty much were the same as maybe a mid-range tropical system here on land.
It'll be interesting
when I say tropical system, I'm talking about like a tropical storm.
Right. It'll be interesting to see if the Hurricane Center does upgrade it or not. I think at the end of the day, though, if there's one lesson to take from this, it's that the Hurricane Center and the National Weather Service offices did what they could to post updates for mariners and to post updates for what to expect. You had the storm warning, the gale warning, the this, that, right? And so even if it doesn't have a name, right, you're now getting into the weeds of meteorology. But a non-tropical low or a subtropical system can still have the same type of impacts. And I always think of like Superstorm Sandy as an example of that. It was transitioning extratropical as it was making landfall.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, that's a great example. And that is a system that on the northern side of it had just a crazy amount of snow because it was late October and it was drawing in colder Canadian air. And that was definitely a storm that will never be forgotten for parts of the East Coast and interior areas as well.
Mickey points out something so interesting, and how did we miss this, Jeremy? I'm going to quote Mickey over on YouTube. So yet another year where May didn't or isn't going to produce a storm unless that Carolina low becomes a storm in post-analysis. How did we not even mention that?
That would be 2 years in a row.
Right.
So, I mean, that's not a long streak by any means, but we did have some Mays where we had those named storms, and now looking like not going to.
Interesting stuff. All right, my friend, we will chat on the phone later. Thank you for hanging out for Tracking the Tropics.
We'll see you next Tuesday.
Bye.